Okay, so we're gonna get started.
Okay.
I'm so pleased to be here with you, Zadie, on the occasion of some incredible moments, kind of leaps and bounds in terms of the exhibitions and projects that you've kind of brought to the fore. I would love for us, as we're kind of getting started, to give some context to your work and your practice, to kind of think backwards to move forward, right? So like starting at maybe the beginning of you doing some of this work, because I think that, as I have seen your work kind of continue to expand over these years, part of what has been so remarkable is that it always feels so detailed and dense, but also as well so effortless, right? Like the presence of your hand is of course there, but it is absolutely impeccable. And you bring to that practice such care. So, I think it's helpful perhaps to kind of zoom out a little bit and to provide some insights about, the beginnings of your relationship with textiles, what that experience was like, and as well, kind of how that has manifested in terms of your growing in the form over time.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, Legacy, I wanted to just to say thank you, and I'm really honored to be speaking with you today. I admire you professionally and also love you as a dear friend. But yes, I started making artwork in art school, really thinking about painting, just traditional kind of painting, conventional painting on a flat surface. And then whilst I was doing my MA at the Royal College of Art, I think it might have even been in 2013, I was still pretty dissatisfied with the stuff I was making.
Hmm.
And kind of came to a head and just thought, right, something needs to change. It needs to shift because I'm really not interested in being a very mediocre painter for the rest of my life, even though I had, dedicated, like, I think up until that point, maybe, 10, 15 years of it, doing things as a young person as well, but just realizing this is not working. And so I had a tutorial with, one of the professors there, and he very bluntly just said, if you took more time to think about your work in the same way you think about the outfits you put on, I think your work would be better. And as soon as he said this, I think he felt really bad because he might have thought I took it in an insulting way, but actually when he said that, I understood right away. I think he was talking basically about pattern and texture and detail, to color and layering, and essentially kind of collage bodies. And when I thought about it that way, I thought, okay, this makes sense. And if I'm interested in textiles, rather than just painting an image of someone wearing a textile, anything, whatever, figured person, cloaked in um, costumes, the appropriate thing would be to be direct and actually use the material. So just like, my thinking of rummaging through vintage shops or clothing stores, I love touching all the clothes. I like feeling everything. I like layering patterns. And so I thought I'd bring that into my work and really think about how the picture plane could work over textiles.
I
And then,
love that,
sorry, go
Zadie.
ahead.
I mean, just because I mean, not to jump in, but I want to just suss that out a little bit because I feel
Yeah,
like it's so generous in terms of thinking about the context there and the ways to where you're kind of bringing together really a kind of foundation in painting and a painterly practice, but
yeah,
allowing it to maybe take a three-dimensional form, which I think is something that often, as we're experiencing and encountering your work, is so tangible. Absolutely, the kind of the movement, the gesture, the kind of art historical awareness is something that's so palpable. But I totally appreciate too, given that you happen to be one of the most stylish people that I know, that part of the kind of allure of some of the work, right, is that actually it begs to be touched and interacted with.
sure. Yeah,
And so, for me, as I, kind of in the early days of seeing, your work and encountering it as it kind of existed in kind of public space, I was so thrilled and inspired to think about the idea of what it means to have it be something that can be wearable.
right.
And it, of course, is within it, there are so many signs and symbols that are kind of built within these textile works, but also, a kind of a language too of a kind of fashion that we see within a kind of popular culture and a certain type of vernacular that to me kind of at points is reminiscent of maybe like the 1990s. I think of like Echo and Averex, moments where there is a kind of a swagger and ascendancy that is folded into a kind of dazzle of fashion. And so I wanted maybe to push you a little further to talk about some of that too, recognizing that you are blending some incredible references as tied to historical citations, right? Thinking of, a kind of Korean Canadian diaspora, but also to kind of running those things alongside of references that we see in the everyday as they exist within the mainstream.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things for me anyways, when one makes that transition of being very comfortable whilst not very good, maybe perhaps only making kind of oil paintings and kind of flipping it to some a medium that you're not kind of fully confident with, I think the thing to do is just to feel what instinctively comes natural to you. That's something I didn't do as a student with painting. I was always trying to be overly intellectual. I think there was a lot of insecurity with kind of like me being from Canada and then being in London and feeling like the weight of all these people that were very invested in a certain type of history of painting that I was not interested in. So when you're not interested in something, your work is, not interesting and it's crappy. So when I was thinking about these textiles, I immediately just thought about, surfaces that I myself was interested in. And I'm someone who, as you said, really likes to think about pop culture, and I'm a very sentimental, nostalgic person. So the thing that I thought about immediately was what are the images or the kind of silhouettes that most made an impact on me as a young person. And for me, obviously, popular culture, like a lot of kids growing up in North America, being obsessed with much music in Canada or MTV in the States, and hip hop was really important for me as a young person. I think it was the thing that really bridged the gap for me to later in life be incredibly committed and interested in kind of racial politics, and also a link bridge to feminism and like Black feminist thought. And also for me, like thinking about performativity and the kinds of like the kind of performance swagger that maybe I would have liked to have had as a young person. So thinking a lot about like really early 90s references, these kind of baggy silhouettes, which I'm still really attracted to. Anyways, I think the thing that most interested me about those clothes were not necessarily only the silhouettes, but actually the surfaces themselves, thinking about them as like painted surfaces, especially considering kind of different patchwork and collage. So if we think about, as you say, kind of these jackets that like the Averex jackets or Echo or Fubu, or even, I don't know what they're called, these like leather jackets in the 90s that had all the flags on them. Like I had one of those jackets, right?
I wanted it so badly.
Yeah, I had one. I think probably, having grown up in Canada and then being my family from Korea, I just thought it was very cool to have like all these flags, and again, thinking about them as markers of identity. And if we relate that to in relation to, let's say, hip hop clothing from the 90s, very much a tie to and influence skateboard or snowboard culture, which I grew up in as a teenager, you have markers of identity which are heavily influencing how you want to project who you are to other people, whether it's bands that you're interested in, hip hop groups. So this is when people are putting stickers on their jackets or their skateboards, whatever. So I think earlier on, I was thinking about how would you reflect garments, and thinking about cloaking the body, and referencing identity politics within fashion is just basically that. And so I wanted to create, I guess, my own kind of network of these symbols that were intrinsically important to me or had some type of sentimental attachment, or I guess in some ways some type of, I guess, magical power that I would be able to kind of stitch into the works.
I love that because, thinking about this question of magic, right? But also to the alchemy of kind of the ordinary. I really appreciate, the notion that, kind of the transition from painting and, into this textile practice, into something that can be worn, right? That this is really kind of a changing of a shape and form. And as well, like you said, it intersects so beautifully with some questions about what it means to perform or wear different selves in the world. Right. Quite literally. And so, in those transformations, I think it's a really great place to maybe pivot a little bit to start talking about what it meant for you to start diving into performance. Because part of the thing that I think has been so exceptional to see from your early performances to present has been that this presence of transformation has been so pivotal. It's been the thing that kind of we see as a through line in terms of shape shifting, in terms of the question of ceremony and ritual. But as well too, in terms of different transitions, right? What it means for that to be something that actually is deeply embedded in the question of the diaspora. And so I'm curious about, that as a leap. And then as well, you thinking through what it means to collaborate with other performers, that in itself is a kind of expansion of a painterly practice, brings a whole other dimension.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just answer the last question about working with people. That's been the most rewarding thing as a person, but also artistically. I think that especially when one is educated in this kind of Western institutional thought of like a singular artistic figure, being the kind of lone genius in the studio. I think particularly attaching that to kind of the romance of painting and the history of that. It's a complete fallacy, first of all. Even those who paint on their own have people that are supporting them.
Right, absolutely.
What I mean to say is, working with other people allows me to, especially with performance, or particular with performance, I would say, allows me to not have full control of work, and that I think is very good for me. I am a control freak. And when you allow yourself to let go, really interesting things can happen. And I think for me, the exciting part about performance is that unlike a painting, kind of don't really know what it's going to be until it's presented live with an audience, right? And you have no control over it. So whilst of course one is making an object or a painting, you don't really know what it's going to be perhaps until later you think about it. But at the same time, once you finish and you've installed it into a space, you kind of know what it's going to look like. But with a performance, because it's live, people can make mistakes. People you work with might decide to kind of do things that are unexpected. Of course, there's a lot of mutual respect. So we talk about these kinds of, I guess, spontaneous things that might occur. But I think as someone who's working with those other people, as the artist, or one of the artists rather, it's really exciting to then see the work unfold before you, because you also don't know what it is. And again, thinking about how working, there's this really amazing quote, it's like, the only thing worthwhile is like working with other people, or like working with other people.
I love that.
And I actually, I really, really deeply feel that in how I want to live my life, how I want to be as an artist, and just like a member of like my small community. Like yeah, that's something that's been very important to me, is to kind of decenter myself in the work, and not thinking about it as like me and then my work, but thinking about the work being the most important thing, and all the people that are kind of underneath this umbrella of the work, of the main goal. These are the team members and the players. And I think it's a much more holistic and interesting and creative way to work. You're only going to be a better artist if you're around other really creative people that you're exchanging ideas, and hopefully crushing the idea that resources are scarce and we need to compete with each other. So kind of bringing people to the fold and wanting to work well. But to answer your first question about working with performance, I think I had always been interested in performativity, even like through static objects, and I just didn't know it because I just don't think I was really exposed to that type of thinking, or perhaps I was really rigid in my very immature kind of art student mind in terms of what I wanted to be, and and so perhaps I wasn't looking further out enough for influences and inspiration.
Right.
But this is why you have it's really important to have a really great network around you. And I would attribute my kind of interest and foray into performance because of conversations I had with friends and colleagues. The work that I'm working through wouldn't be there for me to even think about had I not been around really amazing people who we will continue to talk about in this conversation. But yeah, I mean, this is how I've
Absolutely. I mean, Zadie, I think it's actually really incredible to think about this question of collective practice as an active refusal of a kind of Western way of working. And I want to center that as we kind of expand into maybe the next part of our conversation, if only because I agree with you. It's a mythology that, in terms of this question of genius, that one is in the studio alone with no other contributors, with no other kind of dialogue, with any other strand of thought. It's not real, right? And so part of I think the tension across different questions of you know, appropriation, different tensions about what it means to kind of credit one's collaborators, right? Is that, you know, those things actively have to be folded into the practice, and that is something I think that, you know, really is very clear in terms of the methodology that you have manifested with your work, right? That absolutely these things become communal, that the work almost is not complete until it is engaged with different types of publics,
Yeah.
and that does a certain type of exercise of opening things up further, allowing for different thresholds to be made permeable that maybe traditionally are protected within the fiction of being very fixed and static, and as well immovable. So, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, where that intersects with kind of your engagement of the sonic, because I know that as you're thinking about, you know, the 1990s moments where you were inspired by a certain type of presence, politic, feminism, right? That was embodied by that intersections with music, right? Specifically, that I think it is, you know, an incredible thing to see that music and sound in particular has become so pivotal to how your work exists in the world. There is, you know, very few moments where you are not kind of exercising that muscle, and actually, you know, it has become something that is only kind of built in momentum over time. So, you know, you've just done this incredible 6-piece narrative sound piece for Assembly. Can you speak specifically to, you know, the interface, as in the way that it lives? Because right now, given that we're in this pandemic, it's living on the internet. And so when people are experiencing it, they're experiencing it collectively, but also alone, right? And as well, maybe to touch on some of the citations that the work pulls out, ranging from, you know, this kind of reference to Adrienne Marie Brown, and as well, you know, you're speaking about Princess Vari as a narrative.
You know, this 6-piece audio work, I actually had envisioned that I would make it for an exhibition that's opening on October 28th at the Remy Modern Museum in Canada. And I was really lucky because Somerset House Studios came by and I was able to participate in the sound residency. So as you said, there's kind of 5 different characters that are speaking. They'd be attached to static sculptures in a gallery space, and each would have their moment, and they'd be choreographed between projected lights and sound. But for Assembly, obviously, it needs to live online. So it actually has 2 lives. So yes, it was made for the gallery space, but the way it premiered was online. And so you need to have headphones, preferably, because it's 360 spatial sound. So I worked with Tom Slater of Call and Response, who works with 360 digital sound, something I'd never worked with before. So again,
That's
when we're
amazing.
yeah, you know, again, talking about realizing works and projects that I would not have any idea of how to even do or conceive of, but because I paired up with someone who does, you know, he's lending his craft and his gift, his talents, his expertise to creating that. Anyways, basically, it lives online and you're supposed to listen to it with headphones. I think for me, the idea would be one would sit back and enjoy it kind of the way you would maybe like a story, a podcast, or, you know, perhaps you'd be listening to it while you're cooking or in the studio, doing whatever, on the bus, on the tube, I guess, if you have internet connection. But yeah, it's basically just, it's a it's a narrative told through the eyes of 5 different animals or critters or non-human animals, I should say, kind of speaking about their experiences with their physical surroundings and the destruction that's basically caused by humans and what
Right.
that must be like. And I think as it kind of clearly is illustrated through the narrative, it was really important for me, and it still is, to constantly be thinking about the perspective of other people, and then also animals, right? Non-human animals, because I just feel like the way, you know, things have been going, not just for this year, obviously, for a very long time. It's just,
Absolutely.
so I think the biggest thing that I've been really, really deeply thinking about, I'm sorry I'm taking so long to kind of spit it out, but it's because it means so much to me, is to really move through life with empathy, but in the most genuine way possible. You know, really thinking about how your behavior affects other people, whether you know
Right.
it or not. And
Mhm.
also, I don't know, I guess just for me, just basic kind of lessons of childhood, you know, how would you feel if, this happened to you, right? So I think for me anyways, that's really important. And it actually does, I check myself all the time if I'm having a day, or maybe I speak out of turn, or I don't know, if I'm doing bad with the environment, things I'm consuming. This was my whole kind of thinking through this project. And obviously thinking very heavily about the situation with COVID. I mean, I started making this sound word back in February. So it's very, that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of beginning of lockdown in London, the subsequent, like, movements and protests all over the world. This is just something that's been amplified. Again, something that, it's not surprising and nothing that's just coming to attention, um, for me anyways this year, but it's amplified. And so you start really thinking about it. And also, I think I'm jumping ahead here, but just to quickly touch upon it, we can circle to it again later. My family is from South Korea, but they willingly went to Canada, right? What we call
Mm-hmm.
Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Of their own free will, they wanted to go there, and are happy, and they've done well there. I've very much prospered and benefited from growing up there, but one also has to realize, outside of the own kind of immigrant narrative that my family might carry, there's also the narrative of us living on unceded territories, that and stolen indigenous land, and kind of how one's existence in those places perpetuates violence, whether or not you mean to, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the whole thing about really thinking about things empathetically and not centering oneself, which is hard to do because that's how we kind of move through the world. But that's essentially what I was thinking about whilst I made the work. I'm not saying the work fully contains all of those ideas explicitly, but that was a motivating force for me, I think, to think
I see that so much, and I see, with this discussion of empathy, as intersecting really beautifully with Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, which you note as being something that's been an influence to you. But I also do want to kind of make sure that we spend some time talking about Princess Bari in particular. You speak about these amazing critters, which we can like expand on in just a moment, but I do want to take a moment to think about Princess Bari, and for you to maybe share a little bit about the context there, literally, kind of why that history, right? What does that mean to you? And kind of what does it speak to, especially along the lines of maybe a feminist narrative in particular?
So Princess Bari is a shamanic oral folk tale, and there's kind of variations as there are with all folk tales, but I'll give a very, very short summation. So Princess Bari was the seventh daughter of a king and a queen who only had daughters, and they were unhappy because she wasn't a male heir. So anyway, she was abandoned and taken in by an older couple. Again, this is the story that I'm taking from. Okay, there's like different variations.
Right.
And so basically she gets carried off on the back of a tortoise, meets the dragon king, who tells her, your parents are dying. If you want to save them, you have to travel to the, ends of the western sky in order to find this kind of life-saving water, or this elixir of life of some sort. Okay. And then basically she says, I'm going to do it, goes through, all these hardships for many, many years, finally comes back, brings this elixir of life to her parents who are dead, brings them back to life. The king and queen are incredibly happy because their daughters come back, save them, and say, if you want, you can reign over this kingdom. And she says, no, thanks, I'm good. Actually, I'm just going to continue on my journey of bringing, dead people, souls, to the underworld. And so the reason why I was attracted to that story is because it basically, for me, kind of personifies the idea of hardships that many people go through. And I think I generally always think about, without being too personal, but the kind of the lives of people that I have cared about, or people that have come before me, but also then very much thinking about that with the contrast to, or working alongside the idea of the Korean shaman, right? And about kind of hardships that this person has to go through spiritually and also in their personal life in order to kind of fulfill this position as someone who navigates the underworld and the living. And so with Princess Bari, the main arc of the story is, again, I guess, the hero's journey, right? And so with Moon Poetics, for Courageous Earth Critters and Ancient Daydreamers, it's a very long title. The idea was to put the audience in the shoes of Princess Bari. So the audience is essentially Princess Bari and the animals that are taking them on this guided journey, talking about kind of, I guess, ecological disasters that are happening. that are also tied to the socio-political experiences of, different folks, um, that I was referencing. But anyways, and so I guess what I'm really trying to do is ask questions of the audience to really think about where they're living and how they got there, and also their impact on, their communities and what we're doing. And it's never from the perspective of I'm telling people what I think that they should do. Oftentimes when I'm asking questions, I'm actually asking myself a lot of these questions as well,
Yeah.
and deeply thinking about how I'm implicated in those histories, because it's not finger pointing, but and I guess the metaphorical parents in my story is the planet, it's community, it's all of us, right? Really trying to think about those things as being interconnected. And I just really quickly wanted to say, sorry to cut you off, but really wanting to give credit where credit's due. It was you who told me you must read this book, Emergent Strategy. It's very important. You said to me, you said that to me, I think in 2018, at the end of 2018 or something like that. And obviously I'm going to listen to you, and I just want to thank you, because that book has helped me not to feel really, I guess, super down, and really trying to think, all right, where is this support network? How can I also be a support to people around me? And I understand lots of people are doing that work.
But I think it's important, Zadie, as you're kind of kind of unpacking a little bit for us, like the arc of the thought behind how these pieces have come together, and ways that you're situating the audience in different shoes, right? Like this question of empathy is being a core component of that. This question of allowing for a different type of dialogue and discourse between not only the performers in their kind of transference of energy and presence, but as well the performers and the audience, and allowing that perhaps to be blended in terms of the kind of shifts of power, imagination, and care. And so, I'm thinking through, this language of, and this is quoting you to you, because your words are just so necessary, saving the planet and liberating all creatures. This is something that I think, has continued to embed itself further in your work. And we see that, of course, within the sonic practice, where you kind of note for the piece that, we can find online via Assembly, we are all under colossal threat, and as well note that we are imagining, or reimagining rather, how to heal a broken system. Behind this arc of disaster, it is possible for a new world to emerge. So, this question of the new world in relation to an intersection with climate change in particular feels like something that is very, very important and exciting. Most particularly as well, because as we think about this question of displacement, which you brought up earlier, and as well the ways where we enact certain types of violences without even being aware of them, simply in our presence and in passing through different types of space. Right? That, this in itself breaks from perhaps some of the, I would say, very black and white thinking, right? Like the kind of simple thinking that allows for us to maybe excuse ourselves from having to take certain types of responsibility for our footprint. And so I'm wondering about, what that looks like in terms of when you're thinking about these worlds, not only the performative world that you're creating, which you've spoken to a bit already, but as well, the world that you're kind of imagining toward, because that seems to toe the line between something that maybe is ecstatically utopic and kind of impossible, and then also something that is like totally dystopic and kind of breaks our heart. And so for that reason, I think that space in between that you situate us within is a really vulnerable space. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think I had to make the work, because I'm really in the middle of it, is what I'm trying to say. And I don't have any answers, but I had to kind of speak about my feelings of sadness, disillusionment, depression, basically, about how intensely horrible things are in many different ways. And again, it's not just 2020. We know that, right? This is an accumulation of kind of trauma and perpetuated violence. But it's also super important, and I'm going to say this again about you, because it really is true. It's really important to somehow be optimistic, but not just for the sake of being optimistic, but trying to actually find little pockets of space where you're able to instigate and activate change, even if it's in your small group of friends. And I say that because I've had, a lot of different people say those things to me, like, Eileen Bailey, an amazing artist who I know you also know. Like, I'm sure she would never even think that I'd be saying this, but I remember we had a conversation, I think a year ago, and then, they just said to me, the best thing that I think I can do is make these change in and amongst my own friendship group, and it's
Mhm,
like
mhm.
these small ways in which you can enact change through those types of gestures of care are really important, right? So that's on like the small scale of like, being kind to people out, helping your friends out, whatever, a whole host of things. But then also thinking about that within the big scope of change that needs to happen, whether it's
Exactly.
politically, obviously systemic shifts that need to happen. That it's incredibly exciting to see people really forcefully kind of banging on the door right now, being like things have got to change. And for me anyways, as a person, in order for me to really feel like motivated and feel like we can do this, I need to think of that utopic space, even though understanding there's no such thing as that utopian space, and perhaps it's a boring space if we think of it being hunky-dory and all perfect like that. But wanting to make things more horizontal for people, obviously, and for everything that's living around us. It sometimes is maddening to feel like things are not changing, so I need to also be like, well, what can I do? And for me, I'm an artist, and I think criticisms that I have on myself for thinking about the work that I've done before, there was a huge emphasis on the self, and I know there still is, because these are still my thoughts or the stuff that I'm going through. But really wanting to create work where I'm in active dialogue alongside my peers, people that I'm reading, who I admire, who I am listening to, not because they're ever going to see the work, but the idea that through these conversations, if they expand and we get more people on board and we're having more voices come in, hopefully strategies of change also become further complex and are able to. I read a quote on Instagram the other day that someone put up about having people push from all sides in order to break the thing down, right?
Love
Instead of,
that.
that's kind of what I'm doing. And I'm
Yeah.
apologize for sounding so incoherent, but I'm very much in the middle of it, as I think we all are. And I'm
No,
just,
I'm following you
yeah,
completely. I think it's, it is something that builds ecstatically over your practice. I see it, as it is traveling through not only the collective work that you are doing with kind of creating and staging these performances, the way that you're folding in the audience into that kind of social contract, if you will, right? But also, of course, in your ongoing collaboration with Benito Mayor Vallejo. And Benito, of course, being such a phenomenal artist that, that has brought a certain vision, a sort of acuity, a shape to the sculptural work that you have been expanding on for years of time. Given the kind of intimacy of your collaboration, right? It feels like that Benito has, kind of brought it to new heights in allowing for the imaginations that you have set into action, right? I'm thinking about, the recent performance work that you two presented for Freeze, Dream Dangerous, where, we're seeing the natural form and the machinic form really be blended. But part of the strength, I think, about Benito and in terms of work and understanding of sculptural practice is allowing for the sculptures to, of course, exist as they take their own form. They really do have kind of personalities, right? And we can see that as different performers are embodying them and kind of taking as an opportunity to really transform in real time. And so, you collaborated with the dancer. Is it Zadie Xa?
yes,
I believe. Yeah, who of course brings to the piece the kind of language of cybernetics, but as well blurs this with Korean ritual and spiritualism, most particularly the kind of the mudang. And with the mudang in particular, I've been so excited to learn more about through your work. But as well, it's been really wonderful and kind of amazing to see the mudang begin to appear in many places out in the world as a kind of site of discourse, given that it is both a really prominent thread within a feminist discourse, within a diasporic history, within questions too of relationships between otherworldly beings and beings that, of course, are embedded in the here and now, like, kind of with firmly rooted positions on Earth.
Mhm.
And so, with these masks that Benito has created, can you chat a little bit about how that has shifted or transformed the performers in terms of their relationship to dance, to the bodies that they are occupying, and as well towards kind of what bodies you are envisioning through this lens of the cosmic as you have proposed it?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, first of all, absolutely. Like Benito, his vision, his craft, his care, his talent, his artistry, his creativity, his like conceptualized ideas that end up, as you say, enhance, my own ideas. I'm always going to be indebted to, and also really enjoy working with. I mean, this is, going back to what I said about kind of, for me anyways, everyone works differently, but for me, opening up space, or not opening up space, that sounds really arrogant, but for people to open up space to me and want to work with me on like the larger kind of project or presentation is
Right.
amazing and very exciting, as you say. Um, so yes, I wanted to just say that. And same with Jayu Korti, who's an amazing dancer, has more than like 45 years of dance experience. And I'm just learning so much from her. But with regards to the masks, the first masks he made was for my very first performance at the Serpentine Gallery in 2016. And that was in response to kind of referencing Korean mask folk drama, which is called kalchum. But I think the main reason why I was interested in masks in the first place was, the idea of identity, the idea of concealment, the idea of transformation. But very simply also because I like their sculptural quality, but also the fact that you'd be able to hide behind them as a performer. So I
There's
think
a
in
different type of kind of accountability there too. I mean, not to say that necessarily the goal of the performers is to kind of make mischief, right? But
yeah,
there is in that concealment a different type of authority that maybe is able to be taken. That as well, given the fact that you are often working with female identified performers, that for them to be able to kind of consume or engage the audience in a way that the audience actually is not able to reciprocate on fully, that
yeah,
those questions of consumption feel really necessary, and running those things alongside of maybe the questions of kind of what has been made fetish, right, in terms of as well viewership as it has existed across an art historical canon,
right,
right? And so we often, of course, are seeing female identified bodies, bodies of color that are positioned in that way, where there's so much taking that has been done,
right, right,
and theft in that way, right? And so part of the thing that I think has been incredibly generous in terms of the presence of these sculptural forms is that it shifts what is possible in terms of what that sort of transference and exchange looks like.
right. I mean, I think, first of all, also again, thinking about ritual, there's so many cultures globally have, their own rituals, sacred or otherwise, and often include, regalia, costuming, and masks. So this is something that I feel like a lot of people are familiar with, and even the idea of kind of theatricality. But again, very much what you said. I think initially also the idea to conceal the face was to deny the audience the kind of, the readily available uh, body as object to be consumed. That was a very big concern of mine, and it still is a concern of mine. And I'm also, absolutely aware that it's not perfect, and it probably never will be, because as you said, masks and objects can be fetishized heavily, especially if there seems to be some type of ethnographic, what's the right word, touch to the way things are made, or referencing. Initially I was very heavily invested in referencing Korean masks, although very loosely. I think that's something very important for me to also say. I wasn't born in Korea, and my relationship to Korean traditional culture is one that I've come to later in life, and I flirted with as a child, but because I was so invested in kind of assimilating into like white suburban culture as a teenager, very much rejected anything that had to do with my family's culture. But anyways,
But yeah, I
yeah,
want to touch on that because I think that that is it is monumental and also so generous in terms of just the thought that it is presenting, right? The
yeah,
question of moving one place to another, right? The fact that it was not that movement, right? These are kind of your ancestors who did that work.
right,
And so your presence as a Korean person, right, operates differently. And in terms of you thinking about how that language can be built, it is quite literally embedded within the material of your work to try to figure out, a vernacular that is uniquely Zadie Xa.
Yes. Yeah.
And one that allows for you to kind of rebuild, right, but also to kind of cobble together, really, because
Yeah.
some of the process, and I can speak as a Black American, right, some of the process of speaking to one's history comes with these gaps
Yeah.
because of the fact that we don't know. There are
Yeah.
things we don't know. And
Yeah.
so, I feel so much that the work speaks from those gaps, right? Allows for those gaps to be filled in differently, and that you kind of are pushing them further too, in the prominence of not knowing, but allowing that not
Yeah.
knowing actually to be articulated as being
Right.
a core component of what drives the practice.
Right. Right. Yeah. Sorry. You know what? It's like hard because I feel like you're explaining things in a way. It's everything is very very sharp and precise. I'm like, right. What more do I have to add to the story? Because that's so. Yeah, everything you said,
No,
I'm
I
like,
mean,
this
I'm
is exactly.
agreeing with you. I think it's great to see, Zadie, and just I guess to kind of think through, to go back to
Right.
Benito's sculptures, that like the
Right.
presence of those pieces, right,
Right.
allows for a different type of life to be given to the
Right.
Mudan.
Right.
One
Right.
that actually is not necessarily only rooted in its tradition, right, but
Right.
speaks specifically to what you are doing with it in the here and now.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with also the idea again of shape shifting. So in a physical sense, because I can't create CGI on top of like physical performers. One way to create a shape shifting creature is to quite literally put them in costume, right, and use a mask. And sometimes, having extensive conversations with all the performers that I've worked with that have chosen to work with me, we talk about the mask a lot because I think sometimes the mask can be a real burden for some of these folks because they're so used to connecting with the audience with their face, particularly two of the performers
Mm,
who are specialized in Buto, Yumino Seki and Jayu Korti. They're so used to kind of expressing, I guess, what's physical on the inside or what's emotional on the inside, excuse me, through their face. And when you wear something that's static and you can't move the expressions, I think that can maybe be a hindrance. But I also think of it as something um, that I guess I'm trying to somehow uh, present um, authority or like I don't want to say I'm giving the performance agency. That's not right. I will say this for me. When I used to, be in the performances and I would wear a mask, I felt like the mask was something that also allowed me to kind of be who I fully wanted to be in that moment. So rather than just concealing and allowing me to kind of turn into something else, I felt like I was able to become a heightened version of who I wanted to be in that moment.
I love
And
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess I think also right referencing Korean shamanism and mudangs, as you said, or the more deferential word mansions. I think there is a real distance that I'm also working with. I would never just kind of replicate, uh, a ritual and try to present that to an art audience. First of all, I am incredibly uneducated and have no right to do so, and I just think that causes a lot of other ethical, concerns or questions that I would have. But I am playing with the idea of the Manchur Mudang figure being the kind of intermittent or divider figure that's between the living and the dead, and very much thinking about how that figure operates or can be seen as a metaphor for those who are kind of navigating through the diaspora and being with
Mhm.
many different worlds, and also thinking about that kind of middle liminal space, which I find so interesting. Like even like I guess the idea of the subconscious or the dream space that feels like this in between space of reality and whatever sleep. And so for me, you know, yes, the Korean shaman is kind of like, I guess, the apex figure with a lot of my works whenever there is like a human form or like a mystical form that's present. And a lot of it's not always just tied to spirituality, it's tied to a few things. So one, as you said, deeply rooted in what I would consider like a specifically uniquely Korean feminist perspective, and also one that runs along class lines as well, because traditionally and still contemporaneously, Korean shamans are considered to be at the lowest rung of Korean society, which, from my understanding and my experience, is incredibly hierarchical and rigid in terms of class social structures. And so the idea of an incredibly working class person who has inherited either this, this gift, this talent, this being, or one who chooses to be initiated into because they have a calling, and then also being shunned from society, thinking about Korean shamanism historically through its attempted eradication by Japanese colonialism. It's
Mm,
attempted to be
mhm.
shifted into Shintoism, which was obviously more Japanese. The idea that Confucianism came in from China and also was kind of a patriarchal way of thinking that inserted enforced really rigid gender roles. Korean shamanism is always thought of as matriarchal, or let's say feminine, right? And through that considered hysterical and nonsensical and non academic, which
Mhm.
obviously Confucianism, philosophy, patriarchal academia in the sense, or being
Right.
enlightened. And so I think for me, it just feels so important that something rooted in the country of my family that, is 5,000 years old and predates colonialism and was something that pushed against it for so long. Why would this not be celebrated, right? It just, for me was really interesting. And so for me, even to have these things, this figure in my work, I feel like is in a very small way venerating or kind of showing deference to them, because this is something that's very important for me. And as you said, becoming so visible in popular culture, I've also noticed like there's a lot of I don't know, Instagram influencers who I think are usually Korean American, and they seem very invested in Korean shamanism, which makes me really excited. I follow contemporary Korean shamans, which is just really
Yeah.
interesting because, obviously a shaman is, they have their own business, so they're advertising their services. And for me, I'm basically watching as someone who's really interested and as a student in the sense of wanting to learn more about aspects of this culture, seeing them perform rituals on their Instagram page is fascinating. Or
Absolutely.
else there's an American Korean shaman named Jen who I really like. Her name, I think her handle is the shaman Mudang. Anyway, she's really interesting, and she basically talks about her practice and how she came to it. And she's also an American Korean, a diasporic Korean. And so I think there is this there's this parallel thing going on where folks are interested in kind of delving back to aspects of maybe their family's culture, their own heritage, in a
But
way that
I
wasn't
I
so cool when I was a teenager, basically. And
I
now
mean,
yeah,
but Zadie, you are exploding the whole concept in the most incredible way, because I do feel like that this question of class ascendancy, the
yeah,
question of gender as it is tied to ritual, right? The idea that female identified bodies are the vessels for certain types of spiritual practice, engagement, transference, that we are supposed to carry those things, right? And as well the heavy work of doing that kind of somatic work, of that performative work within a ritual space, right,
mhm,
is something that actually still does not allow for one to truly transcend one's kind of class assignment.
yeah,
And so part of the thing I think that is really interesting about the Mudang as it situates itself within your practice and your work alongside of these amazing critters, right, is that you have allowed for the Mudang to take on a different type of life. And
yeah,
as well, perhaps that, across, as you're saying, these different discussions of what a diasporic Korean history is through a feminist lens, that all of
mhm,
these different folks are kind of contributing to a more kind of collective understanding of how the Mudang can move when moving away perhaps from the origin site. That is something that can be expansive and challenging and rigorous, and like you said, perhaps intuitive too, existing outside of an academic space,
yeah,
but absolutely informing how we may better understand how we perform.
right,
And so, I'm thinking, just as we are kind of pivoting to think about the critters,
right,
because I am recognizing that that is something that's really central, and perhaps I
yeah,
want us to end on that today, to
right,
talk
sure,
about these questions of courageous earth critters or dangerous daydreamers,
yeah,
as you have proposed them. And there
yeah,
is the conch, the orca, the seagull, the cabbage, and the fox.
yeah,
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship across these different critters,
yeah,
amazing as they are, fantastic as they are,
yeah,
and the way that they propose different types of work,
yeah,
quite literally, that these kind of companion species, to borrow a term from Haraway, right, allow for us to perhaps better understand our relationship to labor, but
Yeah.
also too how they labor really on behalf of the world.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, one of the things that I always think about primarily when I'm making works that are kind of held within the institutional space. So as I mentioned earlier, this sound piece, which you can listen to at any time through the Somerset House Studios website for assembly, was made for an exhibition that's going to open, within the next few days. Um,
Just so exciting.
Yeah, it is. I know, I'm excited. But I guess what I wanted to say was I deeply think about the audience all the time with all the exhibitions I do. And so me being from the West Coast and, coming from, a space where marine ecology or the marine environment is very kind of reticent in my mind, I have to understand that that's not the experience for everyone, right? So the show opens up in Saskatoon, and you still want to bring aspects of who you are as a person or things that inspire you to that space, but also wanting to tie in ways in not a disingenuous way, in ways that are real, so that people can also hopefully gravitate towards things that you're interested in, but kind of, tease things out that are related to who they are in their own local communities. So I'll just start off with the fox. This is why I chose the fox, because I mean, for a whole host of reasons, but the show will travel also to the UK, and as you know, Legacy, there's lots of foxes here. If we think
So
about the
many.
fox, that's right. If we think about the fox and kind of like, I guess like a British or Eurocentric kind of history, we think about vermin, right? We think about fox hunts. We think about them being, I guess, thought of as maybe like, from a more North American perspective, I guess like rats or raccoons, just pests. Um, and also thinking about how the fox is often maligned to be a trickster character, right? Kind of an animal of malevolence. And within East Asian culture and folklore, thinking about, the gumiho or the kitsune, and thinking about their relationship with kind of vengeful, evil, female identifying women wanting to manipulate men for their own benefit, to live longer, whatever. What I wanted to say is they're also really very much tied to the supernatural. So thinking about them as conduits to the supernatural, thinking about their kind of characterizations as kind of being a trickster character, but also very much for me, thinking about how they are, as you said, companion species in the urban environment in London where I live, and thinking about how they might frolic and behave in a more kind of a seemingly more wild kind of landscape in Saskatoon, Canada. And so that was the entry point for, hopefully the audience to think this is a recognizable animal that I understand. I can, I can believe this or something. Tying it also to, its relationship within mythology. The seagull for me is such a presence, and also thought about as kind of the trickster. Outside my studio here, I have like a colony of gulls who are always kind of chattering or wailing or stomping about on the ceiling. So I feel very connected to them. But in Vancouver, they're obviously everywhere because it's a coastal city. And for me, I think if I was a bird, I would be a seagull. I've always thought of the seagull as being quite like a very hardy kind of working class type bird that's very opportunistic. Hopefully not in like a malevolent way, but in a way where it's like I need to survive. Like I'm like a hardy kind of a really hardworking creature, and in my story, this bird is basically also I guess a symbol for guardians. This is the way birds or animals that have wings that can soar above us are constantly looking down and watching us, watching over us. Anyways, they're just basically observing us all the time, seeing what we're up to, and probably looking at us like, man, you folks are trouble. But this is this is the other character. And also thinking about the air, and I thought about the air because of obvious pollution, air pollution, and also thinking about coronavirus. This is not coronavirus work at all, but we are all living in it. And when I did make this work, as I said, this was the kind of the early stages of lockdown, and there's all this kind of confusion of how the virus would be transferred through like air droplets or stuff. Thinking about the idea of breathing, also breathing in air. So the orca is a kind of a character, an animal, an icon that I have been thinking about for the past few years, that I've made work thinking about and trying to venerate. I'm really interested in orcas because of their, I guess, respected intelligence that they have, but more so kind of the matriarchal social structures that they have within their families, their pods, and kind of the how can I say, incredibly developed emotional care and response that they have for one another and in their
Mhm.
communities. And also thinking about them from the perspective of living on the Pacific Northwest coast, where there's such a huge presence, thinking about them as kind of like the parallel flip side of people, like thinking about how, you know, how they might be moving through the water and kind of, I guess, being firsthand kind of canaries in the mine, seeing the firsthand the ecological destruction that's happening under the water, and then
Right,
being
right.
the harbingers or the messengers to what might be happening. And I think for me, the orca is actually, you know, how she was in previous work that I had done last year, how she's a stand-in figure for the you know, the Korean shaman figure, how they are kind of the same figure, and it's the idea of shape-shifting or kind of animism, that they're able to kind of take on those different forms. And then the cabbage, I was interested in kind of working around the idea of like plants and flora and fauna, but also particularly tying it to, you know, the Napa Valley cabbage or Chinese cabbages, which,
Mhm.
um, you know, is the vegetable that Korean people use to make kimchi. And, you know, people that are familiar with kimchi or Korean food understand that kimchi is like a power food, really good for your gut. And I think for all Koreans, like a source of national pride. Not that I'm interested in nationalism, because I'm not, but the idea that like kimchi is something that I just very much associated with like a Koreanness still now and when I was a kid. So
Right.
thinking about this character, and again being tied to the earth, what's that communication like in the soil, right? Like, you know, the whole idea is also thinking about, we need to listen. How do we listen to, you know, things that we don't understand verbally, because they have a different like you know, way to communicate or language than those people who, you know, for me anyways, who hear. And then again, we have the concha, which is the last one, I think. And this is just, you know, a reoccurring symbolic motif that I have. I've said this before, but you know, I went to South Korea a few years ago, and as you know, as most people who come from a diasporic background, I was very excited to be there, and I was romanticizing everything. And I was on Jeju Island, and I saw all these, you know, gorgeous large turban shells, and I think, you know, one thinks of beachcombing as a kid, and I was like, wow, there's just so many and they're so amazing, and I was collecting them all. I was having this like really like uh, you know, like coming to the homeland experience, romanticizing everything. And I realized very quickly that actually these turban shells were very, very common. And the hanyo, so like the women divers, were basically, you know, shucking them, like I guess like oyster shucking. And they would have like bin bags, like garbage bags full with like flies flying around them. Like, they're basically, no one is interested except for like the corny Canadian coming over, having this like homeland experience. But anyways, for me, it's a symbol that I really did feel connected to. And also thinking about that idea of play as a child. When you hold a shell up to your ear, you're listening to the waves, right? Or it's like a communicating device, it's a conduit to another world, you know. And so for me, it started becoming this symbol of like how one again accesses those parallel worlds, you know, whether they're ancestral homelands, whether they're in those liminal spaces that exist like alongside the reality that we're living in. And again, how that ties into, I guess, ideas of the supernatural, or the supernatural as a stand-in again for kind of navigating that middle space. And I'm always thinking about that from a diasporic perspective. And again, how that ties into kind of my ideas of mysticism around Korean shamanism. You know, for me, that shell is like the portal or the communicator of all the things that I'm thinking about. And oftentimes that voice that's coming from the shell, it's not actually my voice. I don't even think the stories that I'm telling, you know, they're not from me. They're from lots of different people that I'm thinking
Mhm.
about, I'm listening to, I'm reading, I'm learning about. And yeah, I guess it's like, you know, that voice is also talking to me a lot of the time. So even though in some ways I'm the author of this, I'm not, because these are the words of many different people and different artists that I'm looking to. So I always like to think about my practice, or not my practice, my participation being an artist, as one of collaboration with all the artists who I'm looking at, even if they don't know who I am or don't know my work. But it's, you know, I'm
Mhm.
not making this work in a vacuum.
Right.
So I like to think that it's because, you know, this is a dialogue that we're all participating in. And, you know, people who might stumble across my work or work that I'm making with other people, these are not kind of unique ideas, right? This is very much part of the zeitgeist. This is things that, these are things that we are all thinking about and talking through. And, I'm making the work thinking about those people as well. And
Hmm.
hoping that, yeah, there's lines that are being converged.
Well, Zadie, I mean, I think that is the absolute best and most decadent and incredible, place to conclude on, because you have really led us up to the kind of the highest point of your practice, right? Allowing us to kind of look down and across all that you are building. And I also just, have to say, in terms of speaking of these critters, right, that, that to end on the critters feels incredible, because it gives us some important guides to kind of follow,
Mhm.
both as we're following you out in the world in terms
Mm.
of the signs and symbols and the vernaculars that you have kind of brought to the fore, but as well as we're following this amazing exhibition that you have done, right, in this absolutely bonkers period of time. So, we will be following those critters. They will be our guides, putting our ears up to the shells, if you will. And thank you so much, the incredible Zadie Xa. Having this time is always going to be special and monumental, given just how long we've known each other. So I feel
Right.
lucky to be here with you, and as well to have this time to just expand on all that you have done over these past years. So thank you. I'm super excited for you, and of course, congratulations on your show.
Thank you very much, Legacy. Again, thank you for holding space for me, for taking so much time to really think through amazing questions, and having, just your feedback or just listening to you kind of dissect ideas that I'm working through has been a real treat. And also, I wanted to say congratulations on your book, and everyone should get your book. I just got my copy finally. I am really, really excited to read it. It's not just a plug. It's like, I know you've been doing that work, and this work is connected to things that I'm thinking about. This is what I'm saying. We really are just kind of all working through these things together. So yeah,
It's an amazing conversation across practices. So here's to many more for
yes,
sure.